Just before sunrise, emergency sirens echoed through a quiet neighborhood in Boise, Idaho. As flames consumed a two-story family home, thick black smoke poured through the roof, while dozens of firefighters battled the rapidly spreading fire. According to frantic neighbors, an elderly woman was still trapped somewhere inside. Thermal imaging cameras had become nearly useless because of the intense heat. Visibility inside the structure had dropped to almost zero. Two search teams had already entered the building and been forced to retreat after collapsing ceilings blocked their path. The incident commander faced an impossible decision. Every passing minute reduced the victim's chances of survival. Yet sending another crew inside could cost even more lives. Standing quietly behind the emergency vehicles was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded fire department turnout jacket with retired captain's insignia, carrying an old leather incident notebook beneath one arm, and leaning on a polished ashwood cane. Unlike the crowd watching the flames, he never looked directly at the fire. Instead, he studied the movement of the smoke. His eyes followed the color, speed, and direction of every column rising from the roof, occasionally glancing toward the windows before quietly looking back at the chimney. A group of young firefighters noticed him. One smiled. "Grandpa's reading smoke like it's a weather report." Another laughed. "Maybe he'll tell us where the fire's going next." A third firefighter grinned. "Careful, sir. This isn't the old days anymore. We've got thermal cameras now." The group laughed together. The elderly man simply smiled politely and continued watching the smoke without saying a word. A few moments later, another search crew emerged from the house, empty-handed. The incident commander lowered his helmet in frustration. "We can't locate her," he said quietly. "The floor plan doesn't make sense anymore." At that moment, the old firefighter slowly walked toward the command vehicle. "Excuse me," he said calmly, "before you send another crew inside, may I ask one question?" The commander nodded politely. "Of course, sir." The old man pointed toward the roof. "Has anyone noticed that only one bedroom window is pushing gray smoke instead of black?" Several firefighters exchanged puzzled glances. One answered confidently, "Smoke is smoke." The elderly man gently shook his head. "Not today." Before anyone could respond, a fire department command SUV pulled into the scene. Fire Chief Sarah Mitchell stepped out, saw the elderly visitor, and immediately stopped walking. Without hesitation, she crossed the command area, came to attention, and rendered a respectful firefighter salute. "Captain Thomas Tom Walker," she said with unmistakable admiration. "The department has been hoping you'd visit again." Every firefighter fell silent. Moments earlier, they had believed the quiet old man was simply a retired bystander, watching another emergency unfold. None of them realized they were standing beside one of the most respected fireground commanders in the history of the Boise Fire Department, a man who had spent 39 years leading rescue operations, trained generations of firefighters in smoke reading and structural fire behavior, and once saved an entire apartment building after locating trapped victims using nothing more than the movement of smoke escaping through broken windows. Inside the worn leather incident notebook he carried rested decades of handwritten fireground observations, along with one sealed letter from the battalion chief, who had taught him that smoke never lies. It simply waits for someone patient enough to understand what it is saying. Before another rescue team entered the burning house that morning, every firefighter on scene would discover why the smoke above a burning building often reveals more than the flames below, learn the emotional story hidden inside the old incident notebook, and witness an 80-year-old fire captain locate a trapped victim without stepping a single foot inside the fire. The first emergency call reached the Boise Fire Department at 5:42 on a cold autumn morning. By the time the first engine company arrived, flames had already broken through the roof of a two-story family home on the eastern side of the city. Thick black smoke rolled into the sky, neighbors stood helplessly across the street, and paramedics prepared for what everyone feared would become a recovery operation rather than a rescue. According to family members, 78-year-old Margaret Collins had been asleep upstairs when the fire began. She had never come back outside. Two search teams had already entered the building through different stairwells, but both were forced to retreat when part of the second floor collapsed. Thermal imaging cameras became almost useless, as temperatures climbed higher and dense smoke reflected the heat back into the lenses. Every minute made the rescue more dangerous. Standing quietly behind the fire engines was an 80-year-old man wearing a faded firefighter turnout jacket with retired captain's insignia across the shoulders. Beneath one arm, he carried a weathered leather incident notebook, and a polished ashwood cane supported his slow, careful steps. Unlike the anxious crowd gathered behind the barricades, he never watched the flames. His attention remained fixed on the smoke. He studied the color rising from the roof vents, the speed of the smoke leaving each upstairs window, and the way the wind bent one narrow column while leaving another almost perfectly vertical. Every few seconds he glanced toward the chimney before looking back at the second floor. A group of young firefighters noticed him during a brief pause in the operation. One smiled. That retired captain has been staring at smoke for 10 minutes. Another laughed. Maybe he's trying to predict the weather. A third firefighter grinned. Careful, sir. We've got thermal cameras now. We don't need to read smoke anymore. The group laughed together. The elderly man simply smiled politely and continued watching the roof without answering. Moments later, another search crew emerged from the front door, exhausted and empty-handed. The incident commander removed his helmet for a moment and looked toward the burning house in frustration. We still can't locate her, he said quietly. The floor layout is collapsing faster than our search pattern. The elderly firefighter slowly walked toward the command vehicle. Excuse me, he said calmly. May I ask you something before the next team goes in? The commander nodded respectfully. Of course, sir. The old man pointed toward the second floor. Why are all of your search teams entering from the front staircase? The commander looked surprised. Because the family said the bedrooms are upstairs. Yes, the old man replied gently, but that's not what I asked. Several firefighters exchanged puzzled glances. Then what do you mean? The elderly captain pointed toward the roof. Has anyone noticed that only one bedroom window is releasing light gray smoke instead of heavy black smoke? One firefighter shrugged. Smoke is smoke. The old man quietly shook his head. Not when someone is still alive inside. Before anyone could respond, a white command SUV pulled into the street. Fire Chief Sarah Mitchell stepped out, looked across the scene, and immediately recognized the elderly firefighter standing beside the command post. Without hesitation, she walked directly toward him, came to attention, and rendered a respectful firefighter salute. Captain Thomas Walker, she said warmly. Welcome back. Every firefighter nearby fell completely silent. Thomas returned the salute with quiet dignity. Good morning, Chief. Sarah smiled. I heard you were visiting your granddaughter today. I didn't expect to see you at a working fire. Thomas looked toward the smoke, drifting above the roof. Neither did I. One of the younger firefighters looked at the chief in confusion. Ma'am, you know him? Sarah smiled proudly. Know him? She looked around at the assembled crews. Captain Thomas Walker spent 39 years with this department. She pointed toward the burning house. He trained half the incident commanders serving in this city today. Complete silence settled over the street. Sarah continued. Before thermal imaging cameras became standard equipment, Captain Walker was famous for locating trapped victims by reading smoke movement alone. The firefighters slowly turned back toward the quiet old captain. Only moments earlier they had laughed when he watched the smoke instead of the flames. Now they realized they were standing beside the firefighter whose rescue reports had become required reading in the academy. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the roof before speaking softly. I hope I'm wrong. He paused for just a moment, because 31 years ago, I watched smoke move exactly like this once before. The command post fell completely silent after Captain Thomas Walker mentioned a fire from 31 years earlier. The younger firefighters looked from the elderly captain to Fire Chief Sarah Mitchell, sensing that everyone except them already knew the story. Sarah slowly nodded. The Hawthorne Apartments. Thomas smiled faintly. I hoped I'd never see smoke like that again. One of the company officers stepped forward. Captain, what happened? Thomas rested his weathered leather incident notebook on the hood of the command vehicle before answering. 31 years ago, we responded to a 3-story apartment fire just before dawn. He looked toward the burning house across the street. Heavy smoke. Rapid fire spread. People trapped inside. Almost identical conditions. The firefighters listened without speaking. We had thermal cameras, Thomas continued. At least, what passed for thermal cameras back then? A few firefighters smiled quietly. They couldn't see through the heat, Thomas said. Everything looked like one wall of white. He paused for a moment. The incident commander believed every victim had already been rescued. But they hadn't? One firefighter asked softly. Thomas slowly shook his head. Something bothered me. He pointed toward the smoke, drifting from the upstairs bedroom window. The smoke. Several younger firefighters exchanged confused looks. What about it? Thomas gently folded his arms. Every other window was pushing thick, fast-moving black smoke. He looked toward the roof line, except one. The smoke there was lighter, slower, and it pulsed instead of flowing continuously. The incident commander frowned. What did that mean? Thomas smiled sadly. Someone inside that room was still breathing. Complete silence settled across the command post. One firefighter blinked. Breathing changed the smoke? Thomas nodded. A closed room with a living person behaves differently. He pointed toward the second-floor window. Every breath changes air movement. Every small gap around the door changes pressure. Every movement inside the room changes how smoke escapes. He paused. Most people see smoke. He gently tapped his temple. Experienced firefighters see ventilation. Fire Chief Mitchell quietly nodded. That's exactly what you told us in Academy. Thomas smiled. Back then I didn't fully understand it myself. He opened the old leather notebook. Inside were dozens of hand-drawn floor plans, smoke sketches, ventilation diagrams, and handwritten notes collected during nearly 4 decades of firefighting. Many pages were stained by water and smoke. After that apartment fire, he said quietly, I started writing down everything smoke ever taught me. One firefighter carefully looked at a page showing different shades of smoke drawn with colored pencils. You made all these yourself? Thomas nodded. Every major fire. He turned another page. There, between 2 old incident reports, rested a sealed envelope whose paper had yellowed with age. Fire Chief Mitchell recognized it immediately. Battalion Chief Reynolds. Thomas gently rested one hand on the envelope. He gave it to me after the Hawthorne fire. You've never opened it? Sarah asked. Thomas slowly shook his head. He made me promise. Open it only, he quietly repeated. After you find a generation of firefighters who understand that smoke isn't hiding the victims. He looked toward the burning house once more. It's trying to lead you to them. The entire command staff remained silent. At that moment, another section of the roof collapsed, sending a fresh column of smoke into the morning sky. Thomas never looked at the flames. His eyes remained fixed on the single upstairs bedroom window, where the pale gray smoke continued rising in slow, rhythmic pulses. Then he quietly pointed toward it. She's still in that room. The incident commander looked at him. How can you be so certain? Thomas answered without taking his eyes off the window. Because the smoke is still breathing. The firefighters stood in complete silence as Captain Thomas Walker continued watching the pale gray smoke rising from the second-floor bedroom. Around it, every other opening in the house expelled thick black smoke that surged violently into the cold morning air. Only one window behaved differently. The smoke there moved slowly, almost gently, rising in small pulses before drifting with the wind. Thomas quietly raised his hand. Don't watch the flames, he said. Watch that window. The younger firefighters followed his gaze. At first, they saw nothing unusual. Then one of the company officers frowned. The smoke keeps changing. Thomas nodded. Exactly. The officer looked again. It's almost breathing. Thomas smiled softly. Now you're seeing it. Fire Chief Sarah Mitchell stepped beside him. Explain it for everyone. Thomas pointed toward the bedroom window. A fully involved room pushes smoke with constant pressure. He then pointed toward the neighboring window, where thick black smoke burst outward in a steady stream. Like that. Next, he returned his finger to the pale gray smoke. But this room isn't behaving the same way. One firefighter quietly asked, Why not? Thomas answered without hesitation. Because the fire hasn't fully taken control of that space. He paused. Something inside is interrupting the airflow. Another firefighter frowned. Furniture? Thomas slowly shook his head. No? A personne? Complete silence settled across the command post. The incident commander looked toward the window again. You think she's still alive? Thomas nodded. If she had already died, and the room had become fully involved, he pointed toward the roof. The smoke would match every other opening. He smiled gently. Instead, something inside is still creating small pressure changes. One of the younger firefighters whispered. Her breathing. Thomas nodded once. Very weak. Very slow. But still there. Fire Chief Mitchell immediately turned toward the rescue team. Listen carefully. Every firefighter gathered around. Thomas spoke calmly. Do not send them through the front staircase. Several heads turned in surprise. The collapse above the hallway is already cutting off that route. He pointed toward the side of the house. There's a narrow exterior window directly below the bedroom. The incident commander looked at the building plans on his tablet. His eyes widened. There is. Thomas continued. Raise the ladder to that window. Vent only after the rescue team reaches the room. Do not break any other upstairs windows. One firefighter asked, "Why?" Thomas answered quietly, "Because if you create another ventilation opening first," he looked toward the bedroom, "you'll pull the fire directly toward her." The rescue captain immediately nodded. "Ladder Company 3, with me." Within seconds, firefighters repositioned the aerial ladder along the side of the house. As Thomas predicted, the bedroom window remained the only opening, releasing pale gray smoke. The rescue crew climbed quickly, carefully controlling ventilation until the final moment. The window was broken. One firefighter disappeared inside. The street became completely silent. 20 seconds passed. 30. Forte. Then a voice echoed through the radio. "Come on." Everyone froze. "We've located the victim." A collective breath swept through the crowd. Second floor bedroom. Conscious. The firefighter paused. Barely. Moments later, the rescue crew emerged through the window carrying Margaret Collins wrapped in a rescue blanket. Paramedics rushed forward as neighbors burst into tears of relief. Fire Chief Mitchell slowly turned toward Thomas Walker. "You were right." Thomas quietly watched the pale gray smoke disappear as fresh air entered the room. "No," he said softly. "The smoke was right." The firefighters looked at him without speaking. Thomas gently rested one hand on his worn leather notebook. "We just remembered how to listen." Just then, Chief Mitchell glanced at the old notebook lying open on the command vehicle. Between its final pages rested the same sealed envelope Battalion Chief David Reynolds had handed Thomas 31 years earlier. She smiled quietly. "Captain," Thomas looked at her, "I think today is finally the day." The ambulance disappeared down the street with its lights flashing, carrying Margaret Collins toward the Regional Trauma Center. Around the fireground, the atmosphere changed completely. What only minutes earlier had seemed destined to become a recovery operation had ended as a successful rescue. Firefighters quietly removed their helmets, many still looking toward the second-floor bedroom window where Captain Thomas Walker had pointed before anyone else believed there was still hope. Fire Chief Sarah Mitchell walked over carrying Thomas's weathered leather incident notebook. "Captain," she said softly. Battalion Chief Reynolds waited 31 years for this moment. Thomas looked at the notebook resting in her hands and slowly nodded. "I believe he did." He carefully opened the back cover. Inside rested a yellowed envelope whose edges had softened with age. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were only a few words. "Fatum. Open only after you find firefighters who understand that smoke is trying to save lives, not hide them." Every firefighter gathered around the command vehicle without saying a word. Thomas gently broke the seal. "This was written the morning after the Hawthorne Apartments fire," he said quietly. He unfolded the letter and began reading. "If you're holding this letter, then another generation has finally learned that the fireground begins speaking long before the first hose line is stretched." Thomas paused briefly before continuing. "Many firefighters spend their careers fighting flames. The greatest firefighters learn to understand the air feeding those flames." Several younger firefighters lowered their heads. Thomas continued reading. "Smoke is not your enemy. Smoke is information. It tells you where the fire has been, where it is going, where fresh air is entering, and sometimes where someone is still alive." The only sound came from the distant hiss of water striking the burning house. Thomas reached the final paragraph. "One day, you'll become the oldest firefighter at an emergency scene. When that day comes, remember that your greatest rescue will not be the person you carry out of a building. It will be the firefighter you teach to notice what everyone else ignored." Thomas slowly folded the letter and placed it back inside the notebook. No one spoke. At that moment, the battalion safety officer approached the command post, carrying a thermal imaging camera. "Chief," he said, "we reviewed the camera recordings from the first 2 search teams." Sarah looked at him. "What did you find?" He replayed the footage. The screen showed a wall of white heat, with almost no useful detail. "The victim never appeared on the camera," he explained. "The heat signature from the fire completely overwhelmed the sensor." One of the younger firefighters quietly whispered, "So the camera really couldn't see her?" The safety officer nodded. "No." Fire Chief Mitchell looked toward Thomas. "But the smoke could..." Thomas smiled gently. "The smoke never stopped showing us exactly where she was." The incident commander walked over, still holding the building plans. "Captain," he said quietly, "you found her without entering the structure." Thomas slowly shook his head. "I didn't." He pointed toward the second-floor bedroom window, where only a faint trail of steam now drifted into the morning sky. "She showed us where she was. The firefighters looked confused. Thomas smiled kindly. Every breath she fought to take changed the air inside that room. He gently closed the notebook. All we had to do was notice. By late morning, the fire had been completely extinguished. Investigators confirmed that an electrical fault inside the utility room had started the blaze before flames spread through the walls and into the attic. The bedroom where Margaret Collins had been found remained one of the last spaces reached by the fire. Had the rescue crew searched one more room before climbing the ladder to that window, they would have arrived only minutes too late. As firefighters began packing their equipment, Chief Sarah Mitchell walked beside Captain Thomas Walker across the quiet front yard. "Tom," she said softly, "today you reminded every one of us that experience doesn't retire." Thomas smiled gently. "Experience only matters if someone is willing to pass it on." Sarah nodded before holding up the weathered leather incident notebook. "I'd like your permission to keep this here." Thomas looked at the notebook for several moments before smiling. "It has traveled with me for 39 years. He looked around at the young firefighters cleaning hose lines and rolling equipment. Now it's their turn. Complete silence settled across the fireground. Sarah carefully opened the notebook. Every page contained hand-drawn smoke patterns, building layouts, ventilation sketches, rescue notes, and observations collected during hundreds of structure fires. Some pages carried soot stains. Others had been wrinkled by water from countless emergency scenes. Tucked inside the back cover was one final page, written entirely in Thomas's own handwriting. Across the top were 3 simple principles. Read the smoke before you fight the fire. Protect life before you protect property. Every fire is teaching you something if you are patient enough to learn. The incident commander quietly read the words aloud. No one spoke afterward. Sarah turned toward the firefighters gathered around Engine Company 3. "Beginning today," she announced, "every recruit entering the Boise Fire Department will study these 3 principles before participating in their first live fire training exercise." A quiet murmur of approval spread through the crews. Sarah then smiled at Thomas. "There's one more thing." Together, they drove to Boise Fire Department headquarters, where an empty glass display case had been prepared inside the department's historical gallery. Sarah carefully placed Thomas's weathered incident notebook, Battalion Chief David Reynolds' letter, the original incident report from the Hawthorne Apartments fire, and the radio log from this morning's rescue inside the display. At the center rested a bronze plaque engraved with the words, "The Reynolds, Walker Fireground Legacy," dedicated to Battalion Chief David Reynolds and Captain Thomas Walker, whose courage, wisdom, and devotion to protecting life continue guiding every firefighter who answers the alarm. Great firefighters do not simply fight fire, they learn to understand it. Thomas stood quietly before the display for several long moments before smiling. Chief Reynolds would have said the notebook belonged in a fire engine, not behind glass. Gentle laughter echoed through the gallery. Sarah smiled. "Then we'll honor him by making sure every firefighter who sees it carries those lessons back onto the apparatus." Thomas nodded with quiet satisfaction. Years later, after Captain Thomas Walker passed away peacefully at the age of 90, every new firefighter joining the Boise Fire Department visited that display before receiving their first station assignment. Before learning advanced thermal imaging, ventilation tactics, hose management, or rescue procedures, they first learned the story of one elderly captain who arrived at a burning house as an overlooked retired firefighter, quietly watched the movement of smoke, and located a trapped victim without ever stepping inside the flames. Beside the display, one final bronze inscription welcomed every future firefighter. "Flames demand courage. Smoke demands understanding." The greatest firefighters learned to master both. Most visitors believed they were looking at an old notebook preserved from another era. Those who knew the full story understood they were looking at something far more valuable, a lifetime of hard-earned experience, a promise kept across 3 decades, and the timeless reminder that the greatest rescues are remembered not because of the fire that was extinguished, but because of the life that was brought home safely. Every fire tells a story long before the flames reach the roof. The question is not whether the building is speaking. The question is whether someone has learned how to listen. Captain Thomas Walker understood that after nearly 4 decades of walking into places, everyone else was trying to escape. He learned that courage alone does not save lives. Strength alone does not save lives. Even the most advanced equipment cannot save every victim if firefighters fail to understand what the fire itself is trying to reveal. Battalion Chief David Reynolds left behind a lesson that reaches far beyond the fire service. He believed that smoke is not merely a byproduct of combustion, it is information. It carries the history of the fire, reveals the movement of heat, exposes the flow of air, and sometimes, if someone is patient enough to observe it carefully, points directly toward the people still waiting to be rescued. Modern technology has transformed firefighting. Thermal imaging cameras, advanced protective equipment, drones, and computer modeling have made emergency operations safer than ever before. Yet Thomas reminded an entire generation that technology should sharpen human judgment, never replace it. Every tool has limits. Experience teaches us when to trust those tools and when to trust the quiet observations that no machine can measure. The young firefighters in this story were brave, disciplined, and highly trained. They followed procedures correctly, protected one another, and searched the burning house with determination. None of that was wrong. Thomas simply showed them that before rushing toward the flames, they should first understand the building, the smoke, and the invisible movement of air. Sometimes the greatest advantage in an emergency comes not from moving faster, but from observing more carefully. Thomas often said that firefighters spend their careers learning to fight fire, but the greatest firefighters spend their lives learning to understand it. Fire behaves according to the laws of physics. Smoke follows those same laws. Neither one lies. If something inside a building changes the way smoke moves, there is always a reason. Learning to recognize those small differences can mean the difference between arriving in time and arriving only moments too late. Perhaps the most unforgettable moment in this story was not when Captain Thomas Walker pointed to the exact bedroom where Margaret Collins was still alive, nor when the rescue crew carried her safely through the second-floor window. It was the quiet moment when Thomas opened Battalion Chief Reynolds' letter after 31 years and reminded every firefighter standing around him that the greatest rescue they would ever perform might not be the life they personally save, but the knowledge they pass to the firefighters standing beside them. That is how true traditions survive. That is how lives continue to be protected long after one career has ended. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a firefighter, veteran, police officer, paramedic, teacher, mentor, parent, or friend whose calm experience helped save someone when everyone else believed hope was gone? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about firefighters, veterans, leadership, courage, honor, wisdom, perseverance, sacrifice, friendship, and the extraordinary people whose greatest achievements were not the fires they extinguished, but the lives they quietly brought home. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every firefighter answering alarms in the middle of the night. Protect every rescue team risking their own safety for complete strangers. Strengthen every leader responsible for impossible decisions. Comfort every family waiting for someone to come home safely. And remind all of us that true heroism is not measured by how fearlessly we walk into danger. It is measured by how faithfully we use our knowledge, experience, and compassion to bring others back out again. And may you never forget that sometimes the first cry for help is not a voice from inside a burning building. Sometimes it is the smoke itself, quietly pointing the way to the life that still can be saved.